So your libido is one of humanity's most powerful and potent forces, not your libido specifically, our libido, a man's libido. But what happens when we consciously choose to redirect this libido? Now, while modern society often dismisses celibacy as religious dogma, ideology, or unnecessary restriction, ancient wisdom disagrees. They have long understood it as a tool for spiritual and personal transformation. Now, the three laws or metaphysical laws that we will be exploring here come under the rubric of first, the law of detachment, second, the law of assumption, and third, the law of attraction. And no, this isn't going to be a soft girl video. This is actually going to have some rationality to it. Now, these three principles are going to show us why practices like celibacy and sexual transmutation have such profound effects on consciousness and, let's call it, 3D reality creation or transurfing. Now, I will add a caveat to this. If you find yourself getting mad or not too sure of this metaphysical aspect, please disregard it, as it may go against your current understanding of, reality or Maya, and it might cause you some psychic distress. Anyway, the law of detachment first and foremost. So whether it's abstinence from sex, which is celibacy, it could be food, fasting, or even the sensory world, meditation, they all follow the same principles of detachment from pleasure, a controlled period of time in which you fast from it, you detach from it, where the desire or wanting is a vibrational equivalent of not having. So I've said before that SR is the effect of holy indifference or detachment. You must first collect and cultivate this internally, and then SR becomes an outward reflection of that inner state. When you want something too much, we vibrate at low or the opposite end of that which we want, which creates the reality of not having fundamentally. So this is why things like female attraction is such a thing on SR or celibacy. We cease offering vibration of wanting too much and become a neutral vibrational state, allowing for our desire, female attraction, to come in more effortlessly without resistance to that vibration. But again, the dichotomy is, if you're constantly in that state of wanting, if you go into SR with the presupposition that this is your rationality for it, you push it away. Now, the next is the law of assumption. What we believe we are, will get, will come true. So this one might cause you some distress. When we voluntarily give up something as fundamental as sexual pleasure, really think about this. We make a profound statement to our subconscious mind. Because people, most people anyway, believe in the idea that when we sacrifice something, we will get a reward in greater time, like a greater reward lies on the horizon. It is the assumption of this belief that is far more potent than the mechanisms of it. I will reiterate. This is to say that it is your faith in the mechanism of sacrifice which is the driving factor of its power. Your 3D reality is entirely dependent on how you believe it will unfold itself and present itself for you. You can manifest without the sacrifice, but how else could you raise the faith? In this case, the sacrifice is a psychological tactic that aids your faith in manifestation. Now, by the way, this has been built in your bones for decades and decades and decades, and it will forever be a pendulum that is almost impossible to stop swinging. But I hope I conveyed that well. And the final one is the law of attraction, the concept that we draw to ourselves what we consistently focus on with emotional intensity. The emotional intensity is the most provocative and the most important part. This reveals perhaps the most practical benefit of celibacy, which is the liberation of mental and emotional energy. I mean, consider how much of the average person's emotions and mental capacity is kind of wedged into this area of sexual thoughts and deviancy. Daydreaming, planning or reminiscing about previous encounters, seeking validation through sexual attraction, processing sexual urges and impulses. All of our bandwidth, or I would say most men's bandwidth, is occupied by those things. Now, when we practice celibacy, we don't just suppress these thoughts, we redirect them. We redirect this very powerful and potent energy in another capacity. Now, these, in my estimation, work on three different levels. So the first is when we see sexual fantasy, thinking about even what we eat or materialistic status, we free up. We free up our mind. We liberate energy from a lot of these conditional thinkings. So there's more space and more room to foster new thoughts we may prefer and new desires that are not being competed by more primal instincts like sex or food. The second is not about denying sexual nature. It's by using it. It's by transmuting it. I know that word again has been used many, many times, but it's fundamentally what we're doing here. And a third, and not too dissimilar way, is this idea that these heavy emotions like shame, apathy, and guilt around this particular deviancy can also be leveraged in that particular direction. So this is why men who masturbate, have sex often, and crave the pleasure of sex will also, as a byproduct, be thinking of sex more often. So they're kind of manifesting it more often. This is not to say this is bad, but like any addiction, it may not give a high yield of return in the future. It depletes the person's real estate in thoughts to think about and, other things that might be more harmful, STDs, women taking their finances and just being socially drained. I mean, sex, like food, is very temporary pleasure, while other things may have more long-term pleasure paying off. There is also the satisfaction of food and sex after once achieved that relaxes the person into maybe wanting more, cease imagining things for themselves. Now, if you compare that to a man without sex, fasting or lowering himself into more primal pleasure response, it's freeing up all that mental real estate to think about other things that may have longer payoff, such as growing as a person, helping his community, building wealth to aid others. So your capacity for designing reality is it has far more scope. There's a lot of talk in this particular regard about this concept of mental celibacy. In that way, I firmly believe in principle, I'm not going to pretend like it's easy, but in principle, these ideas will make it far more palatable and practical for you to design reality. All these facts are psychological and energetic manipulation to allow yourself to apply sexual energy. You can think about this as building up your mana or your magic into other more fruitful manifestations. In my estimation, things like food, things like sex, things like accumulating material possessions, they're really illusion driven. They're predicated in this idea of Maya, and their payoff is really short-term pleasure. It's really transient. It's really finite. It's really fleeting. And I have often made the comparison, particularly in the sexual domain, that the behavior is not too dissimilar to somebody on crack or heroin. Fundamentally, when you liberate energy in these particular areas, you will recognize that your capacity to affect the metaphysical, to affect the 3D, you have far more scope, which actually leads you to the deepest realization that you are just the self, you are just the witness, you are just an observer. This Joseph right here, this is just an Atman. It's not the Atman, it's the avatar. I am just in possession of this particular avatar at the time. And I don't expect you to believe me. You're going to come to this realization, hopefully at some point before you return back to source. No theories, facts. Speak soon.